Today with me, I have, for the second time, David DeLima, the South Australian Director for Family Voice. David will today be discussing the renewing of our institutions. Thanks for joining me again.
Well, thanks, Jeremiah. It's great to be with you, and best wishes to all of the viewers.
To begin with, for those who haven't seen our previous interview, could you just talk a little bit about what Family Voice Australia does and what you do?
Family Voice Australia has been going for about 50 years, and we're seeking to encourage Christian people to be salt and light, which means praying for civic authorities, understanding the role of government, and also participating as salt and light in the civic arena. So we greatly need godly individuals who will involve themselves in the political arena. So Family Voice has really been working on that. And we also seek to share the wisdom of Christ for the wise management of the community. And we do that by contacting members of parliament and by encouraging them to understand the difference between right and wrong, what is good for our culture and what is bad. In doing so, we're not trying to impose Christianity, but we're trying to say that the good things that we enjoy have a Christian basis and that must be understood. But we largely argue our position on its merits. So things that are good in the mind of God are also good for the community, and that can be shown scientifically and empirically and historically. So while we have a strong Christian basis, we're not relying on that to make the argument. We are relying on it to make our motivation, and it's the love of God for humanity, which has given us such social institutions as we've been looking at today, for example, the police and the parliament. Yep. So in my own role, I've been involved for about 30 years, and I am busily involved in encouraging Christian people in churches to be prayerful, to be more active, to understand what's going on, and to take action.
Now, I think it's probably helpful to understand why we need to renew our social institutions first. What happened such that we do need needs rather that renewal?
We certainly do need renewal. It's as simple as saying that if you don't take the rubbish out from under the sink and empty it into the rubbish bin, then your house is going to become a very polluted place. Or you've got to clean out the fridge from time to time because rubbish accumulates. Our social institutions, when they are kept in a spick and span manner, when they're looked after, when they're refreshed and renewed, they serve us wonderfully. And, it's a pleasure to open a tidy fridge, isn't it? You can see where everything is. There's no stuff rotting and going bad, no bad odors. And you think of a chef who is operating a restaurant kitchen, and it must be a pleasure for them each day to open the fridge and to know that everything is there, all the ingredients are there, everything's fresh, and everything's good, and we're going to have a fantastic meal as a result. So if you don't mind that culinary analogy, I think that really explains exactly why we need to refresh our institutions.
Yep. Yeah. And I suppose we'll begin with the Parliament. A historian I've spoken to described the Parliament at the time of Menzies as a gentleman's hole. Now I think you could say quite the opposite. There's this, we hear all about this drinking culture and all these things that are happening in Canberra and elsewhere. How would we renew an institution like this?
Yeah. Well, we firstly need to recognize as Christian people that our Lord Jesus is very interested in the work of the Parliament. Almighty God is the author of justice. He's the one true lawgiver and judge. And we read about Jesus that he is seated far above every name, which means not aloof, but supervising. And we read also that every earthly as well as heavenly throne, power, ruler, and authority has been made by him, for him, is sustained by him, and he seeks supremacy over them. So Christian people should have a very, very strong interest in the Parliament because the Parliament contains the seats of power and they are claimed by Christ. So that means that we've got to see what's going on, pray about what's going on, and ensure that what is going on is helpful to the community. Now, this isn't going to necessarily encourage anyone to become a Christian, although that would be wonderful. And if our members of parliament were increasingly Christian and would speak about the things of Christ, they would commend the Christian gospel. But part of the love of God is remarkably on behalf of those who are either hesitant to receive the gospel or don't want it, or are somewhat slack, shall we say, in applying the gospel to their behavior. So even Christian people need law. Fundamentally, of course, things like which side of the road do we drive on? It's not really a moral question, but it's one that relates to the goodness of doing things in a fitting and orderly manner. But also, Christians need to be supervised because some of us on a bad day might do something that we shouldn't. Think of David and his adultery with Bathsheba. And there are many examples of Christian leaders who have come unstuck. So we all need the prompting of the law. So our parliament, left to its own devices, will become rotten. And with all due respect to our members of parliament, we're seeing that happen sometimes on a daily basis as we read newspapers and watch TV. It's also the case, and you've referenced to the gentlemanly conduct of Parliament in the time of Menzies. It's also the case that our parliaments have degenerated with respect to simple human communication and the recognition of dignity one for another. And that means that there are things that are said and done in Parliament that you wouldn't allow in a kindergarten. It's incredible. And it's a real pity, unfortunately, that most of what we see in Parliament is sort of question time, the highlights, the grabs on TV, etc., where we see one MP accusing another of criminal negligence and stupidity. And that may be true, but most of the time, the work of the Parliament is fairly quiet, and it's to do with kind of nuts and bolts activities. So it's a pity that we see the worst. But that worst is really intolerable. It is inexcusable. We wouldn't allow it in our schools or kindergartens, but for some reason we allow it in our parliaments. Mm. And we've got to blame ourselves because Parliament is full of people that we've elected. So unfortunately, we get the Parliament that we choose, or put differently, as Christians, we get the Parliament we pray for. So there is work to do by way of reform, both in the church and in the world, in relation to who it is that we put in charge. And it's important to recognize, of course, that those who are in charge really are in charge. Every aspect of our lives now is remarkably dominated by laws, and they keep making more and more laws. Mm. So our lives increasingly are going to be legalistically controlled. So that needs to be resisted as a concept. We do need some laws, of course, but we just need to make sure that those laws are good laws. But we won't have good laws unless we have good people in the parliament. Yep. So, it's mathematically very simple. We need to make sure that we are electing good people who will pass good laws.
Yeah. What should be done in the cases, in the Senate, when Lydia Thorpe, for example, refuses to pledge allegiance to the Crown? What can we do in these sorts of situations when they're completely undermining the fabric of our institution and of our parliament?
Well, Senator Thorpe did grudgingly give the required allegiance.
Yeah.
She was called out, and so her instincts were otherwise. And it's unfortunate that she gave the allegiance grudgingly, because the whole idea is that it will be given cheerfully. The Bible says God loves a cheerful giver, and none of us can take seriously an apology given to us or a pledge of allegiance which is grudgingly given. It's like the little kids saying, "Well, sorry." It's a start, but it's not acceptable in the long term. So we need to ask a wider question, and that is, why do we produce people who denigrate the very institution that they've been elected to and to serve? It just doesn't make sense. So we've got a much bigger question than one individual senator here, and that's the question of what is Parliament for, and particularly what is the role of allegiance in the Parliament. I'm glad you've raised that, because every member of Parliament must give allegiance to His Majesty the King, his heirs and successors. And I think that's a wonderful thing. I'm really saddened that anyone would think that that's some kind of an imposition or something that they would grudgingly give, because I think it is one of the most valuable assets that we have in our Westminster tradition, is that a neutral and Christian sovereign who is basically duty bound to love his subjects. And we don't expect our members of parliament to love us. We don't expect them to be particularly loving. It'd be nice if they would, but it's part of the job description of the monarch to be loving and to be gracious. And if members of parliament, and we'll come to the police later, but it's MPs, it's the military, it's judges, justices of the peace, all of those making their promise of allegiance should understand what it is that the king stands for. What does he believe and why? What is his mission and what is our ambition? Because we're effectively saying, by making that pledge of allegiance, I'm with him. And if we were to understand that, if our members of parliament and police and military were to understand that, there would be a radical transformation. So all we need to do, in one sense, is to ensure that those who make that pledge understand its meaning and encourage them to explore that meaning and to apply that meaning. That will be a remarkable reformation, which would really be driven powerfully by the gospel of Christ, which monarchs, as part of their job, are effectively duty bound to uphold.
Yeah. And I suppose that goes to some other institutions like our media and our education. They often, even in the curriculum, they'll push things. They'll teach kids to hate their country, to despise the king. That you'll get kids coming out of school who don't respect any of our fundamental institutions and the fabric of our society. How can we turn those sorts of things around?
Yeah, I met a young fellow once, and we were chatting about the Queen. This is about 10 or 12 years ago, and he said, "Oh, the Queen, I hate the Queen." And I said to him, "Oh, is there any particular reason why you hate the Queen?" And that made him think. Now, he'd been raised to hate the Queen, but he had no reason to hate the Queen. And when I asked him why, he had to think for a minute, and he said, "Well, she's got all this power, and she might use that power for evil." Now, this is when Queen Elizabeth had been queen for 60 years. So I said, "Well, she has been queen so far for 60 years, so far so good." And he really had no rational basis for his hatred. And many who reject the crown don't have a rational or logical basis. It's more to do with sentiment and feelings and a complete misunderstanding of the role of the crown. And of course, the crown can't really defend itself. It's not permitted to engage in politicking. But the challenge is for you and me to defend the crown. And I consider it to be a great privilege to do that. And I have a lot of interaction with school children, and they get it from me very strongly and powerfully how blessed we are to have a Christian coronation, and how enriching it is for us to have a system whereby we're encouraging our civic authorities to pledge their allegiance to that Christian crown.
Yep. And I suppose this is something that seems to come up far too much now, without anybody actually thinking about it. Similar to how people can, especially younger people, can just say things about the monarch and not really think about it at all. And that is the separation of church and state. Obviously, you're part of an organisation which is heavily involved in politics. Our sovereign is, it's a Christian institution. The Crown is a Christian institution, and he has to swear to defend the faith. So, what do we say to people who come out with this notion of separation of church and state? And sometimes it does come out of our media. and our education again. So how do we tackle
Mm.
that sort of statement?
Yeah. Well, the doctrine of the separation of church and state really comes to us from the United States. First point. The second point is that the doctrine of the separation of church and state emerged to keep government out of the church, not the church out of government.
Yep.
And in Britain, there is no separation of church and state because the king is head of government. He's also head of, under Christ, he's head of the Anglican Church. So Britain has an established church. So there is no doctrine of the separation of church and state in Britain. And to some extent, that's true also in Australia, because in Australia, we have a constitution in which the Crown is utterly pervasive. There is not one power in the constitution that is not given to us by the Crown.
Yep.
Not one power. And the Governor General, who exercises most of the role of head of state in Australia, only has any power because it's given to him or her by the Crown. And the Crown is a Christian crown. We saw that spectacularly last year in the coronation of King Charles. His commissioning as king is a Christian commissioning. The Bible is read, he's anointed, he's prayed for, Christian hymns are sung, and all of that. So it's also the case in Australia under black letter law, under the Royal Style and Titles Act, that the King or Queen of Australia is there by the grace of God. That's what it says. So the current act, with reference to King Charles, says Charles III, by the grace of God, King of Australia, head of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth there is the Commonwealth of Nations, not the Australian Commonwealth. So black letter law in Australia, which could be changed by simple legislation, but it happens to suit us because it happens to be true.
Yep.
And remarkably, it was the arch Republican Gough Whitlam who gave us that legislation. And the title Queen of Australia, which now has morphed into King of Australia, is from the arch Republican Gough Whitlam that we have that, because it's a recognition of fact. And Gough Whitlam was a constitutional lawyer. He did know his constitution, to some extent at least. I'll give him credit for that. But we need to give Gough wonderful credit for giving us that reality in black letter law, that the King or Queen of Australia, the Sovereign of Australia, is there by the grace of God. So it's a myth to think that somehow Christians shouldn't be involved in politics. Certainly, we want to keep the government out of our schools and our churches, and they're causing a lot of trouble. And that's only going to get worse if we just sit back and do nothing. But while we want to keep government from interfering, it is absolutely necessary and thoroughly proper that Christian people speak prophetically to government and also send people into the political process. It's something that we've not done. Show me a church that's got that on their eldership or business agenda, how we're going to send young people to reform the parliament and the political process. I'll be well pleased to see such a church. We need churches who will do that because Christ has established the seats of government. He is interested in them, and we must be also.
Yep. And if we do have governments which are in opposition to our interests, say they're trying to restrict how we can practice our faith, or they're trying to restrict the rights of Christian schools to employ Christian teachers, how can we do what Paul says? How can we respect the governing authorities while still having obviously civil disobedience and opposing this sort of legislation?
Correct. Well, we need to see Paul's theology and his praxis. His theology comes from his letters, and his praxis, or the practical application of his theology, we see in the book of Acts. So in his letters, he says that we should submit ourselves. Now, what that means is shown for us in the book of Acts. It doesn't mean, as many have thought wrongly, that it means that we should just go quietly and be some kind of a doormat. He strongly emphasizes prayer. I think all Christians would agree with that. But Christians are very divided as to what it means to submit. This word submission, the biblical concept of submission, is very poorly understood. It has nothing to do with being bossed around. abused or trampled or treated like a doormat. And it's got everything to do with stakeholding, participation, and investing. So we see this because Paul not only stands up to the authorities when he's wrongly accused, falsely accused, 4 times in the book of Acts, he upholds his Roman citizenship rights and privileges. And ultimately, of course, his appeal to Caesar, which was effectively a vote of no confidence in the tribunal which was trying him. Because when he said, I appeal to Caesar, he took the matter out of the hand of the governor, which was Governor Festus, and he effectively said, I can see I'm not getting justice here, and I'm going to go to the higher level. So he exercised the right that every Roman citizen has, which is for the emperor himself to adjudicate over their case, either the emperor or the emperor's immediate delegate. Every Roman citizen had that right. It was a fantastic privilege. And I hasten to add that most people in the Roman Empire were not citizens, whereas, of course, here today, most people who live in Australia are citizens, but we don't seem to understand our citizenship rights and privileges very much. But Paul understood, he well understood his Roman citizenship rights and privileges, and 4 times in the book of Acts, he applies them. So his theology must be interpreted in light of his actions. It's like if you want to know the meaning of a word, don't go to the dictionary, because that could be very misleading. If you've got a sentence such as, I will give you a ring, you can look up all those words in the dictionary and have no idea that I'm about to make a phone call to you. I will give you a ring. Okay, so dictionaries they have a place, but it's the reality that defines a word, not the dictionary. It's how people use a word and what actions relate to the word that give us its meaning. So when Paul uses the word submit, he doesn't mean being trampled, and he has shown us that. And further in the book of Acts, as the narrative unfolds, we see Paul effectively taking charge of the ship. He's on his way to Rome, and the people on the ship are in utter despair because a terrible storm has broken out, and Paul effectively takes charge. Now, that's true submission. He rebukes them firstly by saying, I told you we shouldn't have set sail at this time of year, but you wouldn't listen. But now I reassure you, we're all going to be able to survive. At one point, he saw some of the sailors were lowering a lifeboat, ostensibly to lower some anchors, we read, but in fact, they were trying to abscond. Paul says, unless those men stay with the ship, you cannot all be saved. The soldiers whip out their swords and cut the ropes, releasing the little lifeboat, so to speak, and preventing anyone from leaving the ship. Well, who's giving the orders? Paul. He has no position, but he has such moral authority, and they are in such despair that he stands up and he effectively takes charge of the ship. Yep. So that's what submission means. It doesn't mean being trampled down, but it means being a stakeholder and an investor and a leader, even if you don't hold a position. And leadership biblically is action, not position. So, we all wish, if only they'd make me prime minister or something. We can be powerfully influential no matter what is our position in life. Yes, we should aim for higher opportunities, but we are by no means disqualified simply because we don't hold an office or a position, because we are the salt of the earth.
Yep. And you mentioned the police as one of those institutions in need of renewal. Why are the police in need of renewal? What's caused that?
It is necessary for every mechanism or for every institution to have a philosophy, a guiding philosophy, or in the Christian perspective, a theology. So what is the theology for policing? Well, history just answers that question so easily for us. The police were invented because Christians said we need a group of people who will keep the peace, patrol the streets, and do so in a gracious manner. So London was the first great metropolis in the western part of the world. And as a result of the Industrial Revolution, masses of people were coming into London, leaving the rural areas, seeking work, not finding it, and turning to crime. So crime was going off the page in the early 1800s in London. They could have dispatched a military force to crack down on people. But because the gospel had also taken hold of London very powerfully, people like Sir Robert Peel recognised, and he was the commissioner of public works or whatever it was, but it was his responsibility to watch over law and order. He said, what we need is a gracious response. We need agents of social enrichment. And so his vision for community policing was birthed when the first constables were appointed, and they were chosen as respected local individuals who would work and live in the same area. So they wouldn't be strangers coming in. They'd be already recognised as respected and loved individuals who knew everyone, who knew the kids, who would encourage the kids, admonish the kids. So you've got this wonderful notion of local respect for authority. Yes, they would have a weapon, just a truncheon, but it would be hidden in the trousers, and they would wear clothing no different to anyone else. So it wasn't a special uniform. So they were kind of one of us, embedded in the culture to be enrichments of social agents of social enrichment, who would know the families and encourage them as they were growing up. So what a glorious Christian foundation we have at the start of modern policing. And yet now it's all gone because our police have been turned into warriors. They present ready for a rumble. They present ready with exposed sidearm, baton, cuffs, mace, and they, here in South Australia, I'm not sure what it is in Tasmania. I was in New South Wales recently and was pleased to see the light blue uniform of the police. But here in South Australia, we have the menacing black uniform. Only recently come along. Our police used to have a gun that was kind of tucked away in the trousers. Now, I do appreciate that was awkward for access, but now our police routinely bear guns, and I get that there's a place for that. And I recently argued that we need armed security guards in our supermarkets, and this is the last thing that I would ever want to have argued, but I've got to do it now because things have got so bad with this recent Bondi massacre. It wouldn't have happened if security guards were armed. And I've also argued that we need to train people, compulsory military training, and from the elite among those, we would appoint sky marshals on the ground, so to speak, where people would have a concealed gun, trusted individuals who are trained and reliable, and they could whip that out at a moment's notice and would soon put a stop to these massacres. But of greater import is the restoration of community policing, where we have not a military crackdown or an armed crackdown, but where we enrich the culture such that it won't produce people who are ready to go out and murder any woman they can find.
Yep.
So just to go back to briefly to the notion of allegiance, our police badges, and this is true, I think, of every jurisdiction in Australia and for the federal police, they all have the crown as part of their police uniform, and on that is the cross of Christ. So if only our police every day, as they put on the uniform, could look in the mirror and see the cross of Jesus and know that they are doing God's work and know that they are to serve the Prince of Peace, they'd be less likely to take action which they would perhaps later regret. And I'm thinking especially of the situation in Queensland, where the police officer tasered a 96-year-old woman who then fell over and bashed her head and died. I would have thought that he could have disarmed that elderly lady with mental health issues. He could have disarmed her with his little finger. Instead, apparently he whips out the taser. Now we'll have to wait for the court's decision on all of this, but there are many examples, particularly in Victoria, state of Victoria, of police shooting first and thinking about it afterwards, and it shouldn't be that way. So as police put on the uniform, they need to be refreshed in their thinking, as they and they should do this on a daily basis. In fact, everyone who makes a promise of allegiance should do it on a daily basis. They should rehearse what it is that they've promised, and that is to keep His Majesty's peace.
Mm.
And so, in recognizing their allegiance to the king, they need to understand what is it that the king stands for, what does he believe in? And as I've indicated, he's commissioned in a Christian ceremony. Therefore, even if a police officer is not a Christian, they might be of some other faith or of no faith, that doesn't matter. They've got to do effectively what the king would do if he were in their position. And that's primarily to operate with grace.
Mm. Yeah.
So the police need to be refreshed, and it's as simple a task as them understanding their own history. But I think the Christian community has a huge role to nurture the police. Every day when they put on that uniform, it might be their last day.
Mm. Yeah.
Because it's very dangerous to be a police officer. And our churches really ought to be much more closely connected to the police in order to encourage, to pray for them, to enrich their families who must be very anxious at times,
yep.
and to bless them and to remind them of their heritage, their history, and the calling of God that they have no choice but to receive. It's funny, they're trained in weapons handling and all sorts of other things, but they're not trained in theology, and yet they inherit theological treasure
yep.
for the reasons I've indicated.
Yeah. Now, it looks like Zoom is only giving us 3 minutes left. So we'll just close. How can people find the work that you do and support the work that you do?
Yeah, well, Family Voice Australia is the name. Just give that a Google and you'll go to our website. You'll be able to connect with us there. We'd love to send out prayer points and other information to anyone that would benefit from it. So, we've only scratched the surface today, Jeremiah, of course, but I'm sure we'll be able to come back and dig more deeply at a later time.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jeremiah.